Why we do what we do. This is one of those questions I've had since I was a little girl. And if you're anything like me, you found yourself a couple of times in your lifetime where you're like, why did I do that? Maybe you knew it was wrong, or maybe you were just doing the best you could do at that moment. But we find ourselves sometimes going against what we actually wanted to do or what we think is best. My name is Air, and I discuss all things neuroscience, clinical psychology, psychotherapy, and cognitive transcendence here on the NeuroSelf podcast. You can find me previously with the Who Am I podcast, but nowadays I am mostly here as well as Instagram at Air Kraehmer. Now, let's just dive into it because I want to answer this for you all in the best way I can possibly explain it with a new model that I've been able to come up with through doing my own scoping review. So, to give you a little bit of insight on me, I would put myself in the category of a scientist trying to be an influencer and not an influencer trying to be a scientist. So, what I mean by that is I'm educated, I do this research on a daily basis. I'm always looking up new ideas, visiting new places, working with different universities and doctors to be able to really get down to what makes us tick. I specialize mostly in the subconscious networks, as well as when it comes to self concept, which is how we define ourselves, or our self esteem, which is the value that we put upon ourselves. With that, I have been nose deep since July 7th in a new scoping review. And this review started out with the question of why did I do that? So let's get started. A scoping review in general is basically you going into the academic halls of Google Scholar and ProQuest and Discovery and other databases to find every article and scientific study that has been made on this topic. Now, I particularly have found myself developing in a field that is still emerging, which means a lot of conversations that I want to have to be able to answer these very intense and very important questions have not actually been thoroughly studied yet. So, as I go forward to get my doctorate, as I go forward in the world of academia, it is my hope to be able to contribute, to be able to produce more empirical evidence, to be able to provide insight to not just the academic community, but to everyone, to you all, in a very practical, clinical, and outside the clinic type of way. So, I am very big into understanding our subconscious and being able to share what that means in your daily life. Now, you have three forms of consciousness, just to give you a back on Psychology 101. And all three are very important. But in this particular case, I'm very interested in the subconscious. So, first we have our conscious, which is when you're awake, when you're solving problems, when you're going throughout your day, that's your conscious. That's the executive driving factor of your waking survival. Now, thank God we don't have to think about every single decision that we have to make throughout the day. In fact, we don't have to tell our bodies, as you know, to breathe or even at some extent do tasks like driving or brushing our teeth. A lot of those automatic processes come through our subconscious. And that is a developed pathway that basically says, based off of history, I know how to do this almost in an automatic way. Now, that could be biological history, or that could be the history of your personal experiences, such as childhood, adolescence, and even like adulthood. So, that is subconscious. And then finally, we have our unconscious. And our unconscious is something you're probably familiar with when you think of like, she's out cold or he's out cold or they're in a coma or somebody is not actively processing information and having behaviors based off of that in a waking state. Okay. So I want to just give like a little bit of a psychology 101 review. And if that's new to you, you're in a wonderful place because I try my best to take complex information and make it very simple and make it just available. So I'm glad that we had that. Even for myself, sometimes I have to review myself on just basic concepts to be able to really get into the nitty-gritty because sometimes this stuff makes my head hurt, and I will be the first to admit it. So, with that, I am really honed in on that subconscious. Those thoughts and behaviors that we do that are just below our awareness of consciousness, which means like we're not necessarily thinking about them. They're habits or they're tics or they're gestures or mannerisms. You probably have this with like somebody that you're really close with where you know they just do quirky things and they don't even realize they're doing quirky things. Or maybe they're doing annoying things like, tapping their pencil or chewing their gum loudly. They're not thinking about it. You can tell they're not thinking about it, but it's still influencing their behavior and thus your reaction or response to said behavior. Now, I have been working with this scoping review, like I mentioned, and that's taking at least 20 articles. Right now, I have about 23 that studies the subconscious, self-concept, self-esteem, and behavior, and how that all connects, aka why do we do what we do? And I've been able to actually come across something very profound in the fact of there's no direct link to put all of these together in a row. And there's no model that's based off that framework. There's pieces and there's like correlated studies. Like some people would be like, okay, it makes sense that the subconscious would influence behavior. Well, that's a big jump. And then, the grand scheme of things. And the same thing when it comes to like self concept, how we define ourselves. It makes sense on how we define ourselves would influence our behavior. But where does that develop? Where does that come from? Can we change it? So many questions to be had. So, with that, I have developed a model framework that I believe really aligns with the order of how these things happen. Now, I'm still in review. Again, I got 20 articles just based off of this, but this is also completely what my master's was about, what my practice is about, and upcoming with my doctorate. If I, really put it out there because I know it's going to happen, God is good. I'm becoming a research assistant for a cognitive transcendence lab. I'm doing so many beautiful things, so many different associations and societies, and I'm just blessed to be able to work in the field. With that, I have this in an order, but I also want to give an example because I can tell you the order of why we do the things that we do all day long, but I personally need examples on almost everything that's new to me in order to really be like, I got this. Like, this makes sense, right? And if something makes sense, you can start to apply it to your life because ultimately, information is just potential. And until you take that potential and create something with it, what's the point, right? Like, you got to take the library books out of the library sometimes. So, all right, let's get into it. I already mentioned that we work off of this subconscious. Now, what I mean by that is we actually are starting with these earlier experiences in life. Now, early experiences aren't just you being 2 years old and learning to walk, or maybe some trauma from the past or that first relationship. I'm going to go as far to say that early experiences are encoded in our DNA. So this is proven science. It's not on the psychology side so much as the biology side. But thank goodness my undergrads were in organic chemistry and health and human sciences, so I could go there. But here we go. Your mitochondria is part of your cell network. So just to go a little bit deeper, or microscopic, I should say, is your whole body is made of cells. The mitochondria is the powerhouse of those cells. Well, it's also a place where you store DNA that came from your mother. And your mother has information on how she was able to survive throughout her life. Now, that could be all the way down your lineage. Traumatic experiences, refugees, very implicit immigration patterns. How could you survive in a certain type of climate? Did you move climates or environments? Different familial bonds. These are all stored in our DNA. Now, do we express everything? No, right? Now we get into translation, we get into epigenetics, a whole different conversation. But these early experiences and the information tied to them are correlated to how we're going to eventually process our behaviors. So I'm going to also mention that you have this battle between, nature versus nurture, and it truly is a mixture of expression. So if something traumatic happened in your lineage or in your early childhood, it doesn't automatically mean that it's going to show up in your adulthood. But the opposite could also be kind of true. If you've been somebody that has gone through life and it feels like just, wow, how did all these experiences, these crazy things happen to me? So early on, it almost feels like a curse, or like you're paying for someone else's sins, or you're trying to right a wrong in your spiritual pathway of life. Well, some of that might be encoded in your DNA on survival techniques that weren't necessarily important for your survival, but they were important for your mother, your parents, and your ancestors' survival. So I want to be very clear when I talk about early experiences that it's not limited to your personal experiences. Some of them are actually encoded in your history through your body. And if you want to learn more on that, there's a lot of literature on this, including the body keeps the score, or if you go into ancestral constellations or family lineage and timelines, that's all available. You can go very scientific with it with Western medicine, or you can go more holistic and spiritual with Eastern practices and spiritual practices. I'm a huge blender of being able to just honestly use all of these amazing tools and come to our own conclusions and to be able to experiment and learn from each other. So those early experiences are starting our framework, right? That's number one. Now we are developing that storage. That storage is that subconscious. It's the things that we don't necessarily remember happened to us, but did. I don't remember my first breath. I don't remember the first time I walked. I don't necessarily always remember what I ate last week on Tuesday at 11 a.m., or even if I ate at that time, right? But the body does, and the subconscious does. And we have a part of our brain, the hippocampus, that is our memory storage, and it's using all of that information to prolong our survival, right? So our subconscious is very good at this. In fact, she is like a devoted wife because she is exactly doing that, making sure that everything that we share with her from our conscious level or our unconscious level gets processed to help us survive. She just wants to keep us safe. And we got to thank her for that, right? Like a devoted mom, wife, husband, you name it, right? Okay. So what ends up happening from there is we get what's called automatic implicit representations. This is the third step of my pathway, which I'll stop right now and tell you that I actually named this pathway the AIR model because of the automatic implicit representation part of it, right? A little bit of a pun in there. I love to play with words, especially if it helps people remember things. And this form is what's actually developing what this represents for us, right? All of the information that we're storing from our subconscious isn't going to end up in some type of behavior, right? I could be walking down the street, see a pink car, and it mean nothing to me at that time or ever, but it's still in the storage, right? So at this point, step 3, everything's automatic. Implicit means to be hidden, which means hidden from your awareness here, right? So we got something automatically hidden that may or may not become a representation of like what our life is going to become later on, the form of self. All right. So if you're with me, we're actually segueing really smoothly into number 4, which is the self concept. You're taking these early experiences, our subconscious processes, and our automatic implicit representations to develop our self concept. Number 4. Now, self concept, very simply, and I've said it a couple of times, but I even say it always together because these terms can get confusing, is how we define ourselves, right? It's like, who am I? I had an entire podcast based off of who am I for 3 years, where I had different representatives from the community, from different industries, businesses. They were all powerhouses in their field, all so successful, and really trying to develop that question of who am I? And therefore, like, what will I become? Right? So, self concept now is starting to build off of these first 3 prior steps. All right. Now, being enough in who you are, your awareness of self is wonderful. But we don't just live in an abstract world or a spiritual realm. We live in a physical realm as well, right? We walk around, we go to work, we hang out with our family, we hang out with our friends, etc., right? So we got to be able to take this very abstract notion of who am I, our existence, and start to put it into the physical world in order to have some type of behavior behind it. Okay? So here we go. We're taking our who am I and we're developing into what is called self-esteem. This self-esteem is the perception, and this is important, perception of your self-value, how you perceive your worth in this world. Okay? Now that's going to have a huge impact later down the road when we talk about behavior and new experiences, because your perceived value of yourself and the actual value of yourself are very different. Now, the goal is to get them as close as possible throughout our lifetimes. And if you're a godly woman or a spiritual woman like me, then your value would ultimately come from the identity of your creator, which would be God. But a lot of people do not see themselves the way that God does. And if you're not somebody that is spiritual or religious, that's okay too, because you can also think of it as someone that just loves you so much, cares about you so much, like a parent or a dear friend, and sees your value higher than you do for yourself. And if you've ever been in a relationship where your mother or your father or your friend said, "You're way too good for that person," you know exactly what I mean. Okay? So your self-esteem is the value that you perceive for yourself. Do you think you're good enough for a new project or a new goal? Or do you think that you bring something to the table, or are you the table? Right? There's so many different ways to talk about self-esteem, but this definitely is going to influence our behavior later down the road. All right. Moving in to actually physical ways this plays out. Okay. Now we have number 6, which is coping mechanisms. Now, coping mechanisms are both emotional as well as physical acts that we can do, right? A coping mechanism could be like from attachment theory, where you're avoidant or you have anxiety or you run that flight, fright, freeze type of like concept. I think I put fright in there. Oh my goodness. Fight, light, or freeze type of like response, right? But coping mechanisms can also be very tactile. Smoking, promiscuous behavior, overeating and not eating, so many different ways to cope, right? And there's also positive ways to cope, right? It's not always negative. That's a very bad connotation that we have from the world. It's like coping mechanisms are bad. No, you can have great coping mechanisms. Taking a walk, talking about your feelings in therapy, meditation, yoga, exercise. A lot of these could be very good and positive, and sometimes it really depends on how you execute them on if they're good or bad. Okay? So, developing your coping mechanisms is 100% going to be derived from your self-concept as well as your self-esteem. Now, moving in to number 7. Now we have psychological outcomes. Okay. What does this mean when it comes to how I influence the world? Okay. I now have a whole reaction or response, depending on if you willingly wanted to do it or if you were more subconsciously doing something, right? Of how this influences me. What does this make of me? Like, what do I do with this information? And how does it affect other people in my life, right? A lot of your coping mechanisms are going to affect your relationships. They're going to affect your job. It's going to affect sometimes if you leave the house or if you don't leave the house, if you eat a carton of ice cream or you don't eat a carton of ice cream, or if you get off your butt and you start making changes, right? These are all psychological outcomes that we process all the information we've learned from our inside or implicit to our explicit atmosphere, right? Our physical world. Now, finally, we'll lead to number 8, which actually is new experiences, right? Once I know the outcome of all of my behaviors and all of my emotional regulations and how I define myself, I'm going to go do something with that information, right? We're going to apply it. So I do want to let you know that these new experiences kind of feed back to the very beginning, because new experiences in this world that we live in this concept of linear time, if you will, do eventually restart us to be early experiences. Everything that's new eventually becomes old, right? And the world keeps going until the world stops going, right? So with that, this information will now be processed to eventually help you define yourself in a new way, or see your value in a new way, or have a new type of coping mechanism or behavior, which is great because it means that we can change. It means that we can grow, we can heal, we can thrive, we can do so many beautiful things knowing this pathway and knowing this information. So I do want to kind of get into more like an example of how this plays out that I feel will be very relatable for everybody, right? I try to make it to where somebody has always experienced this, unless you're like coming out of the wound. And honestly, it's like even the moment you come out of the wound, you could technically experience this. But here we go. Let's say, in my example, that somebody is experiencing frustration, right? You are frustrated about whatever topic. It could be work, it could be a relationship, doesn't matter. You're frustrated, okay? You have earlier experiences in your life where you were frustrated with something, okay? So you know in your storage of your DNA, or in the storage of your personal linear timeline of early adulthood or childhood or adolescence, where you have this from your past, right? And you reacted in some type of way, or you responded in some type of way in the past to being frustrated, okay? Now, your subconscious, remember, has all that information, and that's amazing 'cause she's doing a good job at her job, right? And now you have representations of what you have done with that in the past, as well as potential representations of what it could be done in the future, right? Because we are in a very relational species, and you have relations even through your ancestral DNA. So you have many options of basically, what do I do with this, right? With this frustration, okay? With that, you have a self-concept that's being developed here, okay? So you go from someone who is expressing their frustration, you may have an automatic implicit representation of, I'm causing problems, right? Like, maybe you want to cause problems, maybe you don't. That's a whole different conversation. But now you have this representation of like, okay, causing problems, right? You might go into your next step, which is actually very reasonable, of like, I did something wrong, right? How did I end up here, right? Maybe something was done to you. Maybe it was out of your control. Maybe it was something you knew you shouldn't have done. But now you're thinking, I did something wrong, okay? So you got, I'm causing problems. I did something wrong. Your self-concept, how we define ourselves, might say something like, I'm difficult, right? Again, maybe you're willingly being a brat. Or maybe you're not, but your self-concept is sharing that thought of, I'm being difficult. And recall, this is just an example. You could have many different ideas or developments off of your personal history. You may be like, I'm not being difficult, and you don't consider yourself a difficult person. And that's perfectly dandy too. But just for this example, you're saying I'm difficult. Okay. Now you're going to move in to your self-esteem and your coping mechanisms, right? One of your self-esteem could be, I enjoy being difficult. I value like my personal boundaries. Or it could be, nope, I feel like I'm being difficult. I need to change, or I don't belong, or you don't feel like you're valued in whatever situation you found yourself in where you're frustrated. Okay. Remember, that's perceived at the same time, though, because somebody else could be looking at the situation and think something entirely different. This happens all the time whenever people are in disagreements and in conflict. So you watch the news, if you watch wars, it's everywhere. All right. But now we get into our coping mechanisms here. You might be experiencing emotional regulation through shame, anxiety, people pleasing, avoidance, bartering, the stages of grief, so many different ways. Okay. You're going to have a psychological outcome out of this experience. You're going to have some type of conclusion that you drew from this. And most of the time, it does take us a little bit of time to process it, right? It's that 4 a.m. waking up in the middle of the night and saying, I should have said that, or I should have done that. Or maybe it's like 5 weeks later and you're regretting a breakup, or regretting taking a new job, or whatever, right? Or it could be positive, right? In this particular scenario, it was a little bit more on the negative side because it was about frustration and emotions that we don't necessarily want to have. But this could be a positive thing, coming at peace with something, realizing that you reacted or responded in a whole new way, right? And what is that going to do for your future? Well, remember, the new experiences eventually become the old experiences. So this entire framework is 100% in development still. I still feel very aligned with it. I know that just like this framework says, is as I get more experiences, learn more, partner with new doctors and scientists and practitioners, that this could change, right? Or be added to, or become a little bit more complex, maybe more simple. Who knows? But that's the beauty of just listening to the process in general that I've developed with the AIR model is, hey, it works. And so far, everything is clicking. Now, again, when it comes to empirical evidence, there's not a lot of studies that directly get you from A to like B, or I guess A to Z in this case, right? From 1 to 8. But what I can say is I'm really enjoying seeing where the scoping review is going, meeting with new doctors, meeting with new MDs, PhDs, side eyes, scientists, the whole 9 yards, right? And I'm really looking forward to being able to do this research on an academic level as a PhD candidate in a research setting with one of these labs. My heart is set on, to be honest with you, whether it has to do with the neuroscience side, transcendence, or it has to do with psychopathology. All of this is going to matter at the end of the day. So I will kind of put a cap on this for now and say thank you for everybody that has been sending in their questions when it comes to psychology, neuroscience, or psychotherapy. I'm having fun answering them on Instagram and in the channel for NeuroSelf. And I look forward to not only like just finishing this journey, because I don't want it to necessarily finish. I'm enjoying being on the journey itself. So I think that this is going to be at least a decade's amount of work for me. I may transfer into like a different part of the field, but this idea of who am I and why do we do the things that we do just makes me tick. It makes my heart thrive and be happy. So with that being said, Until next time, you can find me on Instagram. You can find me on the podcast at Air Kramer or NeuroSelf. And if you want to book an appointment with me directly to work one on one or in a group setting, you can find that on neuroself.io. And until then, I look forward to seeing you on social.